You know, one of the things I love about doing this show is that every once in a while somebody asks a question that's simple enough to fit on a cocktail napkin, but complicated enough to keep economists, politicians, billionaires, college professors, and people yelling at each other on social media busy for the next decade. This one started with a question that sounds almost innocent. Can you believe in capitalism and still think there ought to be some limit on wealth? That's the kind of question that instantly divides a room. Half the audience starts thinking about free markets. The other half starts thinking about yachts so large they need their own zip code. Everybody suddenly has an opinion. And honestly, it's a fair question. I've always considered myself somebody who believes capitalism works. Not perfectly. Nothing involving human beings ever works perfectly. Human beings will figure out a way to screw up a lemonade stand if you leave them alone long enough. Still, capitalism has done something remarkable. It has rewarded innovation. It has encouraged people to build companies, invent products, and create businesses that didn't exist before. Americans have always admired that. We like success stories. We like the idea that somebody starts in a garage and ends up changing the world. It's practically one of our national religions. So I threw the question out there because it gets to the heart of something that's making a lot of people uncomfortable today. Can somebody simply become too rich? Not rich, not really rich, not billionaire rich. We're talking about something that until recently sounded like science fiction, a trillionaire. That word barely existed not long ago. Now people say it casually, like they're ordering coffee. I'll have a latte. And one future trillionaire, please. The audience laughed, but underneath the laughter was something serious. Americans generally don't hate success. That's important. Unlike some countries where extreme wealth immediately creates suspicion, we've traditionally looked at someone making a fortune and thought, good for them. Maybe someday that'll be me. That's always been part of the American dream. People should be able to make it. People should be able to succeed. That's one of the engines that keeps this country running. We don't automatically assume someone worth $100 million is evil or someone worth $1 billion. Some people don't even automatically object to someone becoming worth $1 trillion. That's a pretty uniquely American instinct. But there's another side to the conversation. Because even people who admire success eventually start asking a different question. What happens when success feels impossible for everyone else? One of my guests made exactly that point. The issue isn't necessarily that somebody becomes unimaginably wealthy. The issue is whether everybody else still believes they have a path upward. That's a completely different argument. If people think the ladder still exists, they might applaud the person standing on the top rung. If they think the ladder has been pulled away, well, then they stop cheering. They start wondering who stole the ladder. That's where the conversation shifted. Americans don't simply want rich people to exist. They want opportunity to exist. Doctorants want to believe their kids can climb higher than they did. Workers want to believe effort still matters. Students want to believe talent still matters. Entrepreneurs want to believe that if they build something extraordinary, they'll have a chance. Without that belief, something starts breaking, not necessarily the economy, something deeper. Trust. One of the guests pointed out that there are plenty of Americans who simply don't trust their leaders anymore. They don't trust elites. They don't believe the system works the same way for everybody. That skepticism doesn't come out of nowhere. People watch headlines. They notice patterns. They connect dots. Whether those dots should be connected or not is another debate entirely. But they connect them. One example came up almost immediately. The possibility of America's first trillionaire. That idea doesn't exist in isolation. People notice who has influence. People notice political donations. People notice proximity to power. When someone becomes one of the wealthiest people in history while also contributing enormous sums of money to a presidential campaign, many Americans don't simply shrug. They ask questions. Is that coincidence? Is that influence? Is that access? The point wasn't simply about one person. It was about perception, because perception shapes trust. And once trust disappears, people begin assuming the rules are different, depending on who you are. The guest explained that average Americans don't feel they have that kind of access. No matter how intelligent they are, no matter how hard they work, no matter how many hours they put in. They don't believe they can walk into the same rooms. They don't believe they can influence the same decisions. That's where frustration grows. And frustration has a funny way of changing the conversation. At first, people complain about wages. Then they complain about housing. Then they complain about opportunity. Eventually, they're questioning the entire economic system. That's a very different discussion. The interesting thing was that nobody around the table was arguing against success itself. Nobody was saying people shouldn't invent companies. Nobody was saying innovation is bad. Nobody was arguing that building extraordinary businesses somehow becomes immoral the moment the stock price goes high enough. Instead, the focus kept returning to something much more personal: mobility, opportunity, the American dream. Those words carry enormous weight because they've always been connected. If you believe you have opportunity, you can tolerate somebody else becoming wildly successful. You might even admire them. If you don't believe opportunity exists anymore, success starts looking suspicious, not because someone earned money, because you believe the game isn't open anymore. That distinction matters. It's the difference between envy and discouragement. One says, I wish I had what they have. The other says, I'll never have the chance. Those are completely different emotions. One inspires ambition. The other breeds resentment. That's why I wanted to push the discussion a little further. I asked the obvious follow-up, should we actually be okay with having a trillionaire? The audience reacted immediately, because that's the question, not billionaires. We've already crossed that bridge. We're talking about another category entirely. $1,000 billion. Numbers so large they stop feeling like money and start feeling like astronomy. You almost need a telescope to look at them. One guest admitted he didn't really have a problem with it. His reasoning was straightforward. If somebody builds companies, if somebody creates businesses, if those companies grow because consumers voluntarily choose them, then the wealth that follows isn't automatically something to fear. That's capitalism. Innovation creates value. Value creates growth. Growth creates wealth, at least. That's the theory. And it's difficult to argue that many of the world's biggest companies weren't built through enormous amounts of work, risk, and vision. The companies didn't simply appear. People built them. They hired employees. They developed products. They competed. They expanded. That's the story capitalism likes telling. The concern, he explained, wasn't really about billionaires themselves. The concern was the wealth gap. That phrase gets thrown around constantly. Sometimes people hear it and immediately assume someone wants to confiscate fortunes. But that wasn't the point being made. The point was emotional as much as economic. You don't want ordinary people believing their financial struggles exist because billionaires exist. Because once they make that leap, everything changes. Instead of asking how to improve opportunity, people begin asking whether capitalism itself has failed. And that's a dangerous turn in the conversation. Because if people conclude the economic system doesn't work, they're naturally going to start looking for alternatives. That's where ideas like socialism suddenly gain attention. Not necessarily because people have studied economic theory, but because disappointment makes alternatives sound attractive. It's a cycle we've seen before. When faith disappears, new promises become appealing. The guest argued that this is exactly why billionaires shouldn't automatically become the villains of every economic discussion. They're running businesses. They're creating products. They're investing. They're innovating. Hopefully, all of that leads to job creation and economic growth. That's the optimistic version. If those things happen, then the conversation shouldn't be about blaming wealthy individuals simply because they're wealthy. Instead, the conversation should focus on making sure everyone else still has opportunities worth chasing. That means thinking about regulations, maybe taxes, maybe policies that reinforce the idea that the system remains open. Different people will disagree about which tools work best, but the goal remains the same. Convince Americans that they still have a chance, because hope is one of the strongest economic forces there is. People invest when they have hope. They start businesses when they have hope. They work harder when they have hope. Take hope away, and it doesn't matter how healthy your stock market looks. People stop believing. And once belief disappears, rebuilding it becomes incredibly difficult. The discussion kept circling back to one essential question: how do you preserve capitalism without allowing people to lose faith in capitalism? That isn't an easy balance. If you punish success too aggressively, you discourage innovation. If you ignore widening frustration, you encourage cynicism. Neither outcome is especially attractive. That's why conversations like this matter. Because they're not really about billionaires. They're about what ordinary Americans believe is possible. And just when it seemed like we'd explored every angle, I realized something. Everybody kept talking about billionaires. But the headline that sparked this discussion wasn't about billionaires anymore. It was about something even bigger, something almost absurd in scale, a trillionaire. And that's where I decided to stop talking around the issue and ask the question that was sitting in the middle of the table, waiting for someone to say it out loud. That's when I had to interrupt everybody, because I noticed something funny about the discussion. Every few minutes someone would say billionaires, then somebody else would say wealth inequality. Then we'd drift into talking about capitalism, taxes, opportunity, the American dream, all important subjects, but they weren't exactly the headline sitting in front of us. I finally said what had been bouncing around in my head the entire conversation. Okay, but you guys keep saying billionaires, and the story today is trillionaires. There's a difference, a huge difference. Actually, huge doesn't even begin to describe it. People hear the words billion and trillion and assume they're neighbors. They aren't neighbors. They're barely living in the same universe. 1 million seconds is about 12 days. 1 billion seconds is roughly 32 years. 1 trillion seconds. You're talking about more than 30,000 years. That's the kind of number that makes your brain throw up its hands and say, I'm taking the afternoon off. So yes, billionaires and trillionaires belong in different conversations. A billionaire is someone whose wealth already exceeds what almost anyone can imagine. A trillionaire is a category that forces everyone to redefine the meaning of too much. Even saying the word out loud feels strange. Trillionaire. It's almost cartoonish. It sounds like the villain in a superhero movie. You expect him to have a volcano lair and a pet shark, but this wasn't a comic book. This was a real conversation about a possibility people were beginning to take seriously. That changes the stakes. One of the guests acknowledged the distinction with a quick nod. Fair. Exactly, fair. Let's actually talk about the number that's making everybody nervous. Because if we're going to debate wealth, let's debate the wealth we're actually discussing. So I asked something that, to me, sounded almost practical. Would it really be so outrageous to have some kind of legal ceiling? Not a ceiling that says nobody can become rich, not one that says nobody can become a billionaire, not one that punishes innovation. Just some upper boundary that says there comes a point where one individual simply cannot accumulate beyond a certain share of the country's economy. I phrased it as plainly as I could. Could there be a law saying one person can't own more than 1% of the gross domestic product? Think about that. 1%, even saying it slowly, sounds enormous. 1% of the economic output of the entire United States. Most people spend their lives hoping they'll own 1% of the block they live on. We're talking about 1% of an entire nation's production. Now, before anybody starts screaming that I've become Karl Marx overnight, that's not what I was saying. I wasn't arguing against entrepreneurship. I wasn't arguing against building companies. I wasn't arguing against success. I was asking whether there might be a point where the scale itself deserves discussion. Because scale changes everything. A neighborhood grocery store isn't the same as a nationwide supermarket chain. A regional airline isn't the same as controlling international aviation. And a billionaire isn't the same thing as a trillionaire. At some point, quantity becomes quality, or maybe absurdity. That's why history matters. I reminded everyone that we've seen moments before when lawmakers decided extraordinary concentrations of wealth deserved attention. John D. Rockefeller became the obvious example. When his influence grew to extraordinary levels, laws eventually followed. That wasn't history declaring success illegal. It was history recognizing that immense economic concentration can raise new questions. Different era, different economy, different circumstances. The principle was worth remembering, When wealth reaches a scale that affects society itself, people inevitably begin debating whether the rules should change. That's not revolutionary, that's historical. One of the guests nodded again. Not because everybody suddenly agreed, because everyone recognized the question. It's a legitimate question. Whether you answer yes or no is another matter. That's where I think conversations about capitalism become far more interesting than the slogans people like throwing around. Too often we reduce everything to bumper stickers. Tax the rich, protect capitalism, eat the billionaires, leave entrepreneurs alone. Great, now what? Those slogans don't solve anything. Real conversations require uncomfortable questions, questions that don't fit neatly into political parties, questions that make both sides a little uncomfortable, because if you're a committed capitalist, you have to admit that concentrated wealth can create concentrated influence. And if you're a committed critic of capitalism, you have to admit that innovation has produced extraordinary prosperity. Those two things can both be true. Reality usually refuses to fit inside campaign slogans. That's what I enjoy about these discussions. Nobody gets to stay completely comfortable. Somebody has to defend why limitless accumulation is always acceptable. Somebody else has to explain why government intervention wouldn't create different problems. Everybody gets challenged. That's healthier than everybody applauding their own side. One thing that struck me throughout the conversation was how often we return to trust. Trust in leaders, trust in institutions, trust in opportunity. Those words kept appearing, even when nobody used them directly, because underneath every argument about wealth is a simpler emotional question. Do people believe the game is fair? Notice I didn't say equal. America has never promised equal outcomes. That's never been the deal. The promise has always been opportunity, or at least the belief in opportunity. People can accept losing. People hate believing the game was rigged before it started. That's why perceptions matter almost as much as policies. If millions of Americans feel that influence belongs only to the ultra-wealthy, then frustration grows regardless of which statistics economists cite. You can produce charts showing employment. You can point to stock indexes. You can explain GDP growth. But if people don't believe those gains include them, those charts become wallpaper. Economics isn't just numbers, it's confidence. Confidence that effort still means something. Confidence that talent still opens doors. Confidence that tomorrow can be better than today. Lose that confidence, and political debates become far more emotional. That's when people stop arguing over percentages and start questioning the entire structure. One guest had already warned about exactly that blaming billionaires for every economic frustration eventually becomes blaming capitalism itself. Once that leap happens, people naturally become interested in alternatives. Socialism entered the conversation for exactly that reason, not because everyone around the table wanted socialism, quite the opposite. The point being made was that dissatisfaction creates demand for different answers. If people conclude the existing system has stopped working for ordinary families, they'll look elsewhere. History is full of examples of that. That doesn't automatically make the alternatives correct. It explains why they're attractive. People don't usually abandon systems that they believe are working for them. They abandon systems they believe have abandoned them. That's an important distinction, and it's why I kept steering the conversation away from personalities. It's tempting to reduce everything to one famous billionaire, or one political figure, or one campaign donation. That's easy television. But it's not the deeper issue. The deeper issue is whether Americans still believe that they can write their own success story. That belief has always been one of this country's greatest strengths. You don't have to guarantee success. You have to preserve the possibility. That's enough to inspire millions of people. The moment possibility starts disappearing, resentment begins replacing ambition. That's dangerous, not just politically, economically, culturally. Socially, hope is productive. Hopelessness rarely is. The discussion was becoming surprisingly philosophical. We started with a number, $1 trillion. Now we were talking about faith. Funny how that happens. Money conversations are almost never just about money. They're about values, they're about fairness, they're about expectations, they're about what kind of society people think they're living in. And those questions don't have easy answers. You can hear it in the audience. Some applause comes from agreement. Some comes from relief. People are relieved. Somebody finally asked the question they were already thinking. Could there actually be such a thing as enough? Not enough to retire, not enough to buy a house, not enough to own 10 houses, enough, period. Capitalism has always encouraged people to keep building, keep investing, keep expanding. That's part of its genius. The challenge comes when expansion reaches a scale nobody previously imagined. Then society has to decide whether existing assumptions still make sense. That's not anti-capitalist. That's what societies do. Technology changes. Markets change. Industries change. Questions change. The conversation kept moving back and forth between principle and practicality. Should there be regulations? Maybe should there be taxes? Possibly. Should government create policies that reinforce opportunity? Most people around the table seemed comfortable saying yes to that. The disagreement wasn't over whether opportunity matters. Everybody agreed it does. The disagreement centered on how best to preserve it without punishing success. That's the balancing act. Too little intervention, and people fear wealth becomes untouchable. Too much intervention, and people fear innovation slows down. Neither side wants the economy to stop growing. Neither side wants opportunity to disappear. They're simply arguing about different ways of protecting it. That's why reducing the discussion to rich versus poor misses almost everything interesting. The more interesting question is this: how do you convince ordinary Americans that the future still belongs to them? That's harder than writing a tax bill. It's harder than passing regulations, because confidence can't simply be legislated. It has to be earned. People have to see opportunity, not just hear speeches about it. That may be the biggest challenge of all. As I listened to everyone, I couldn't help smiling at one last observation. Sometimes the best way to expose the absurdity of a gigantic number is through ordinary life. Forget economic theory for a second. Forget policy papers. Forget campaign speeches. Imagine introducing yourself at a bar. What do you drive? Oh, nothing special. What do you own? Well, about 1% of the United States. Now that's a pickup line. I don't care who you are. That's one hell of a flex. The audience laughed because everybody instantly understood the joke. It worked precisely because the number itself had become ridiculous. Not ridiculous as an argument, ridiculous as a scale. 1% of an entire nation's economy. You almost can't picture it. And maybe that's exactly why conversations like this matter. Because once numbers become too large to imagine, it's easy to stop asking questions about them. It's easier to shrug. It's easier to assume someone else has already figured it out. But democracy depends on asking uncomfortable questions before the answers become permanent. Whether America eventually produces trillionaires or not wasn't really the only issue. The bigger issue is whether the country could preserve the optimism that built it in the first place. Could people still believe effort matters? Could they still believe innovation pays off? Could they still believe success is attainable without believing the system belongs only to those already standing at the top? Those questions don't disappear just because the stock market goes up. If anything, they become more important. And sitting there, looking out at the audience, I realized we hadn't really settled the argument. Maybe we weren't supposed to. Sometimes the value isn't in reaching unanimous agreement. Sometimes it's simply in refusing to stop asking the questions. By the time the conversation started winding down, I realized something that probably should have been obvious from the beginning. Nobody on that stage was really arguing about a number. Not really. Sure, we kept saying billionaire. Then we corrected ourselves and said trillionaire. We talked about 1% of the nation's gross domestic product. We talked about wealth gaps. We talked about taxes, regulations, innovation, opportunity, and public trust. But underneath all of those topics was a much older question. How much inequality can a society tolerate before people stop believing they're part of the same story? That's the question. Not because it's easy to answer, because it's impossible to avoid. America has always had wealthy people. From the earliest industrialists to the biggest names in technology, we've admired people who built something extraordinary. That's woven into our national identity. We celebrate inventors. We celebrate entrepreneurs. We celebrate people who take enormous risks That's why our business stories often sound like fairy tales. Somebody starts with almost nothing. They build an idea, the idea becomes a company. The company changes an industry. And everybody wants to know what was in the garage, what was written on the napkin, what was said during that first meeting. We love those stories because they reinforce something we've always wanted to believe. That success is possible. Not guaranteed, possible. There's a huge difference. That's why I don't automatically hear billionaire and think villain. Life isn't a comic book. Most successful companies didn't become successful by accident. They required vision. They required risk. They required countless decisions that could have gone wrong. They required people willing to bet everything on an idea nobody else believed in. Capitalism rewards that, and frankly, it should. If people are willing to create products, services, and businesses that millions voluntarily choose to use, it makes sense that extraordinary success can follow. That part has never bothered me very much. What does concern me, and what clearly concerns a lot of Americans, is what happens when the distance between extraordinary success and ordinary life becomes so vast that it feels impossible to cross, because once that happens, the conversation changes. It stops being about admiration. It starts becoming about accessibility. Can anyone still get there? Or has there become reserved for a handful of people who already occupy a completely different universe? That's where the discussion kept returning. Whether we intended it to or not, opportunity, the word sounds simple, but it's carrying an awful lot of weight these days. When parents tell their children to study hard, work hard, and dream big, they're making an implicit promise. They're saying those things still matter. Imagine what happens if enough people stop believing that promise. Imagine working just as hard as your parents worked. Imagine getting an education. Imagine doing everything society tells you to do and still feeling farther away from financial security than the generation before you. That's not just an economic problem. That's a psychological one. People don't simply lose money. They lose confidence. And confidence is incredibly difficult to rebuild once it's gone. That's why one of the most important observations during our discussion had almost nothing to do with wealth itself. It had to do with mobility. That word stuck with me. Mobility, the ability to move upward, the belief that tomorrow can be better than today, the confidence that your children might have opportunities you never had. That's always been one of America's greatest selling points. We're constantly telling ourselves and the rest of the world that this is a place where people can reinvent themselves, where talent matters, where ambition matters, where ideas matter. Those aren't just patriotic slogans. They're part of our national identity. So if people begin doubting those ideas, it's worth paying attention, not because pessimism is fashionable, because belief is essential. You don't build great companies without belief. You don't create jobs without belief. You don't invest without belief. You don't innovate without believing tomorrow offers possibilities today doesn't. Hope has economic value. That's something economists sometimes forget. You can measure inflation. You can measure unemployment. You can measure growth. Measuring optimism is a little harder, but you'd better believe it matters. A country where people think hard work pays off behaves very differently from one where people think the outcome has already been decided. That's why the guest's warning about blaming billionaires stayed with me. He wasn't defending every wealthy person. He wasn't arguing that every billionaire is perfect. He was making a broader point. If Americans decide that every economic problem can be explained simply by pointing at rich people, then eventually they'll stop asking deeper questions. Questions about education, questions about opportunity, questions about growth, questions about innovation, questions about public policy. Everything gets reduced to villains and heroes. Real life rarely works that way. At the same time, pretending public frustration doesn't exist isn't much of a strategy either. People don't become skeptical because somebody tells them to. They become skeptical because something in their own experience makes them question what they've always believed, ignoring that skepticism won't make it disappear. You have to address it. That's where thoughtful policy comes into the picture. Notice I said thoughtful, not reactionary, not ideological, thoughtful. One guest suggested regulations, maybe taxes, maybe policies designed to reinforce opportunity. The details can and certainly will be debated. That's politics. The underlying objective seems surprisingly consistent. Restore confidence, not by tearing successful people down, by making sure everyone else still believes they have a chance to climb. That's a very different goal. It's constructive instead of destructive. It says success isn't the enemy. Hopelessness is. That's a distinction worth preserving. I also kept thinking about something else. How quickly public debates become personal. Take any conversation about wealth, and before long, people start naming individuals, one billionaire, another billionaire, a political figure, a donor, a CEO. That's understandable. People connect ideas to faces. It's human nature. But focusing exclusively on personalities sometimes distracts us from the larger issue because the names will change. The underlying questions won't. Today's richest individual won't always be tomorrow's richest individual. Industries evolve. Companies rise, companies fall. Technology changes. Markets shift. History keeps moving. The broader questions stay remarkably consistent. How do you encourage innovation? How do you preserve competition? How do you reward excellence? How do you expand opportunity? How do you maintain public trust? Those aren't Republican questions. They aren't Democratic questions. They're American questions. And they've been American questions for a very long time. That's why I found the historical reference so interesting. When I mentioned John D. Rockefeller, it wasn't to suggest history repeats itself perfectly. History never does. Different people, different industries, different technologies, different challenges. The point was simply that America has previously confronted moments when unprecedented economic power forced policymakers to ask new questions. That's part of governing. Circumstances change. The rules sometimes evolve with them. That doesn't mean success becomes illegal. It means societies periodically reassess how they balance freedom, competition, and public confidence. Those conversations aren't signs of failure. They're signs that democracy is still functioning. People ask questions. Other people disagree. Everybody argues. Eventually, somebody writes legislation. Then everybody argues about that. It's a beautiful, exhausting process, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. One thing I've learned after years of sitting behind that desk is that audiences don't expect every question to have a perfect answer. They do expect honesty. Sometimes honesty means admitting there isn't a clean solution. This felt like one of those moments. Could America eventually produce a trillionaire? Maybe should it? Reasonable people can disagree. Should government establish limits? People will disagree about that too. Should regulations exist? Probably another endless debate. Should taxes change? Ask 10 economists and you'll get 12 opinions. But there are a few things almost everyone around the table seemed to recognize. Opportunity matters, trust matters, mobility matters, innovation matters. Those ideas don't cancel one another out. They have to coexist. That's the challenge, maintaining enough freedom for extraordinary achievement while preserving enough confidence that ordinary Americans continue believing extraordinary achievement remains within reach. It's a difficult balance. Maybe the most difficult balance capitalism has ever faced. As the applause settled down, I couldn't help returning to the joke that ended the exchange, because humor has a funny way of exposing truth. Imagine introducing yourself. So, what do you do? Oh, I'm worth 1% of the United States. It's ridiculous, which is exactly why everybody laughed. Sometimes numbers become so large they stop sounding like reality. They're almost abstract. Like talking about galaxies or infinity or the number of streaming services you're apparently supposed to subscribe to now. The joke worked because it translated an incomprehensible figure into something absurdly human. Trying to impress somebody, trying to show off, trying to explain unimaginable wealth in everyday conversation. Comedy often works that way. It takes enormous ideas and shrinks them down to ordinary life. That's what happened here. We spent an entire discussion wrestling with capitalism, wealth, fairness, public confidence, and the future of economic opportunity. Then we ended with a joke about picking someone up. That's America in a nutshell. We'll argue passionately about philosophy for 20 minutes, then somebody makes a joke, everybody laughs, and suddenly the conversation feels a little more manageable. Not because the issues disappeared, because laughter reminds us we're all still sitting at the same table. As I looked around, I realized that was probably the healthiest outcome we could hope for. Not unanimous agreement, not ideological victory. Just a willingness to keep asking difficult questions without pretending the answers are simple. Capitalism isn't perfect. Neither are governments, neither are markets, neither are people. Every system reflects the strengths and weaknesses of the human beings operating inside it. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is improvement. If innovation continues creating prosperity, that's worth celebrating. If opportunity begins slipping away, that's worth confronting. If public trust erodes, that's worth repairing. And if conversations like this make people think a little more carefully before choosing sides, then they've already accomplished something valuable. That's ultimately why I wanted to ask the question in the first place, not because I had a neatly packaged answer waiting in my back pocket. Because asking good questions is sometimes more important than pretending to have perfect answers. Can someone believe in capitalism while also wondering whether there should be limits on wealth? I think that's a perfectly legitimate question. Can someone admire extraordinary success while worrying about diminishing opportunity? That's a legitimate question too. Can someone defend innovation without dismissing public frustration? Absolutely. None of those positions cancel each other out. In fact, holding them together may be exactly what this moment requires. Because if America wants to preserve the promise that hard work, talent, and imagination can still change a person's life, then the conversation can't stop at celebrating wealth. It also has to include protecting opportunity. That's the real heart of the debate, not whether one person eventually reaches $1 trillion. Whether everyone else still believes they have a path worth chasing. And if we can keep arguing about that honestly, even when we disagree, we'll probably be in better shape than a society that stops asking the question altogether.